My son secretly sold my entire collection of antique stamps and coins worth nearly $700,000, which I had spent 30 years collecting to pour it all into a virtual investment platform he believed was a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to prove himself to his wife. 2 weeks later, he came back, his eyes calculating, begging me to sell more of the house to save him. I said just one word: no. 4 seconds later, his hand was on my chest and I fell down the stairs of our house. He told the paramedics he slipped. I remained silent because what he didn't know was that I had created the moment that would end his life. Your presence here means more than you know. Leave a comment below. Where in the world are you watching from? I want to hear from you. Brief note: this story blends fiction with purpose, created to entertain and to teach something worth remembering. Names and locations are coincidental, but the message carried through every chapter was always meant for you. I've spent 40 years learning how to read people, 40 years studying the way a liar blinks too slowly, the way a guilty man holds his coffee cup with both hands, even when the room is warm, the way fear looks different from grief when you know what you're searching for. After all that time, I thought nothing could catch me off guard. I was wrong about that, but only once. It was January in Chicago, and the snow outside my living room window was the kind that falls in thick. Heavy curtains, the kind that muffles the whole city, until the only sound left is your own heartbeat. I was standing at the top of my staircase, looking down at the front door, when the knock came. I already knew who it was before I opened it. Caleb was standing on my porch with Valeria just behind his left shoulder. My son was 41 years old, and looked at that moment like a man who had swallowed something he couldn't digest. His coat was expensive, it always was, but his eyes told a different story. Red around the edges, jaw tight. The kind of face a person makes when they've rehearsed what they're about to say so many times that the words have gone hollow. Valeria stood behind him in a charcoal wool coat, her dark hair pulled back clean and neat. She gave me a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. She was good at that smile. I'd seen it before at Thanksgiving dinners and birthday lunches, the smile that said everything was fine, even when nothing was. "Dad," Caleb said, "we need to talk." I stepped back and let them in. We sat in the living room. I took my chair by the fireplace, the old leather one that Margaret always said smelled like a library, and they sat across from me on the couch close together, which told me they'd talked about this on the drive over, maybe for days before that. Caleb leaned forward with his elbows on his knees and told me the story. The digital gold exchange, the one he'd sunk the money from my stamp and coin collection into, had collapsed. $700,000. Gone. He used words like liquidity crisis and market volatility and regulatory freeze, the kind of language designed to make the listener feel too unsophisticated to argue. I'd heard versions of that language in interrogation rooms for 4 decades. It sounded just as hollow coming from my son as it had from every fraud suspect I'd ever put across a table. "We need you to sell the house, Dad," he said finally. "The creditors, they're serious people. We don't have time." I looked at him for a long moment. Then I looked at Valeria, who was watching me with those calm, calculating eyes that I'd long suspected saw everything and felt very little. Then I said the only word that needed to be said: no. What happened next took maybe 4 seconds. It felt longer. Caleb stood up. He crossed the 12 feet between us faster than I expected a man in dress shoes to move. I saw his hands come up, and I want to be clear, because I've replayed this moment more times than I can count. I saw it coming, and I didn't move. Not because I was slow, because I was 68 years old with a decision already made. And sometimes you have to let a thing happen so that the record shows it happened. His hands hit my chest, and I went backward. The staircase was right behind me. I don't remember all of the fall. The brain does a person, the courtesy of blurring certain things. But I remember the sound. 2 ribs going on the 4th step down, my left wrist catching the banister wrong, and then the floor of the foyer rushing up to meet me. I lay there looking up at the ceiling. The chandelier above the staircase was swaying slightly from the impact. Valeria screamed. It was a good scream, sharp-shocked the right length. If I hadn't spent a career listening to the difference between genuine terror and performance, I might have believed it. Caleb was already on his phone. "My father, he slipped on the stairs. He's 68. He has a heart condition, please. We need an ambulance." His voice cracked in exactly the right place. I didn't correct him. I turned my head slowly to the left, where the wall at the base of the stairs held the one thing in that house I never moved. never rearranged, never let anyone touch. Margaret's portrait. Oil on canvas painted the year before she got sick. She was looking slightly to the right in it, the way she always looked when she was thinking something through, and the painter had somehow caught the particular quality of her attention. I looked at her for a moment. Then Caleb crouched down beside me, and his hand came to my shoulder, and his face arranged itself into the expression of a devastated son. It was a good performance. It really was. If I'd been anyone else, I might have reached up and taken that hand and told him it was going to be all right. Instead, I met his eyes and held them. You made the biggest mistake of your life tonight, son. Not because you put me on this floor, but because you did it believing I hadn't seen it coming. The ambulance siren started up somewhere out in the snow, still a few blocks away, but getting closer. I closed my eyes. And lying there on the cold marble of my own foyer, with 2 broken ribs and a fractured wrist, and my son's hand on my shoulder, like a prop in a play, I let my mind drift back 4 months, back to a quiet autumn afternoon, when a stranger with a very expensive briefcase knocked on my door, and a 40-year career instinct told me that everything was about to go sideways. That was the day it really started, not tonight. On the ambulance ride to Northwestern Memorial, with an oxygen mask over my face and a paramedic asking me questions I answered on autopilot, my mind did what it has always done under pressure. It went back to the beginning. 4 months earlier, Chicago was a different city. September had painted the elm trees along my driveway in shades of copper and burnt orange, and the afternoon light came through the west-facing windows of my collection room in long, warm slants that made the whole space feel like the inside of an old photograph. That room was my favorite place in the house. Margaret always said it smelled like history, a mixture of archival paper cedar wood, and something she could never quite name, but said reminded her of the rare bookshop in Hyde Park where we'd spent a rainy Saturday 30 years ago. The collection had taken us 30 years to build. Stamps and coins, mostly rare issues, limited pressings, a few pieces that serious collectors would travel across the country to examine. The crown jewel was a 1918 inverted Jenny, an American airmail stamp, where the biplane had been printed upside down by mistake. Only 100 of them existed in the world. Margaret had found it at an estate sale in Evanston in 1997, tucked inside a shoebox of loose papers, and she'd called me from the parking lot, laughing so hard I thought something was wrong. We'd had it authenticated 3 times before either of us truly believed it. At current market value, that single stamp was worth close to $90,000. The full collection, every piece cataloged, every provenance documented, was appraised at just under $700,000. It was the kind of number that changes the way people look at you when they find out. I'd learned to be careful about who found out. Caleb called 2 weeks before the visit. He said he'd been talking to a financial advisor, someone from his firm, who had pointed out that I was carrying an uninsured asset worth more than $500,000. He said it kept him up at night worrying about it. He said he'd found someone who could do a proper appraisal and set up a specialized collector's insurance policy. His voice had that particular warmth it carried when he wanted something, the kind of warmth that took me too many years to recognize for what it was. I told him to bring the man over. His name was Stuart Mead, and he arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in a charcoal suit that fit him well enough to be custom, but not well enough to be expensive. He knew his stamps. I'll give him that. He held the inverted Jenny in his gloved hands and spoke about the 1918 printing error with the kind of fluency that only comes from genuine study. He knew the Curtiss JN-4 biplane by name. He knew which of the 100 known copies had sold at Siegel auction galleries and for how much. If I hadn't been watching him the way I watch everyone, with the particular patience of a man who has spent 4 decades waiting for the one thing a person doesn't mean to show, I might have been impressed. But I was watching him, and the thing I noticed was this Stuart Mead never put his briefcase down. Not when he shook my hand at the door. Not when he sat at the examination table. Not when he leaned over the display cases. Most people, even careful people, set a bag down within the first 5 minutes of entering a room. The shoulder gets tired. It's a natural thing. Stuart Mead carried that briefcase like it was attached to him, like he'd been trained to keep it close. And that is the kind of detail that lodges itself in the back of a trained mind and refuses to leave quietly. I let it lodge. About 40 minutes into the visit, I settled back into the leather chair in the corner and let my eyes go soft, the particular kind of unfocus that reads as drowsiness to someone who isn't looking carefully. I've used that trick in more interviews than I can count. People say remarkable things when they believe you're not paying attention. Through my lashes, I watch Caleb. He waited until Stuart was bent over the coin collection with his loupe, and then he took out his phone and began photographing the stamps, methodically, starting from the left side of the display case and working right. Not snapshots, careful, deliberate images close enough to capture every detail of every piece. My son was documenting my collection. When Stuart announced he needed some water, I straightened up slowly in the chair and waited until his footsteps faded down the hall toward the kitchen. Then I stood, crossed to the examination table in 4 quiet steps, and looked at the briefcase he had finally set down because he had to, because he needed both hands for the coin tray. I didn't open it. I didn't touch it. But I have spent enough years handling evidence to know the shape of things through a layer of leather. The rectangular outline along the inner left panel was not a laptop. It was not a tablet. It was something smaller and flatter, with 2 slight protrusions along the top edge that I recognized the way a doctor recognizes a bone through skin. A scanning device. The kind used to capture the internal mechanisms of electronic locks. I was back in the chair, eyes half closed before Stuart's footsteps returned from the kitchen. Observe first, conclude later. It's the first rule every good investigator learns, and the last one they forget when it becomes personal. I had forgotten it once in my life with Caleb, and that forgetting had cost me years of believing in a version of my son that apparently existed only in my own head. I wasn't going to forget it again. After they left, I stood alone in the collection room as the afternoon light faded from gold to gray. I looked at the inverted Jenny in its case. Margaret had held it the same way Stuart Mead had, with the same gloved care, but her hands had been shaking slightly with excitement, and she'd kept looking up at me every few seconds like she needed to confirm it was real. Stuart Mead had never looked up once. I took my phone from my pocket and opened my contacts. I scrolled to a name I hadn't called in 3 years. A man I'd worked alongside on a case involving a stolen art ring back in 2020. A man whose particular skill set sat at the exact intersection of financial crime and digital forensics. The kind of man who could tell me, without touching it, what that device in the briefcase was designed to do. My thumb hovered over the name. Then I pressed call. It rang twice. Well, the voice on the other end said, and even after 3 years, it was immediately familiar. Dry, unhurried, the voice of someone who treated urgency as a personal insult. It's been a while. Benedict, something tells me this isn't a wellness check. I need to meet with you, I said. Tomorrow morning. A pause. Then, my office, 8 o'clock, bring coffee. The elevator doors opened on the 18th floor, and the hallway felt warmer than the lobby had. That had always been the thing about Elias Vance's building. The lower floors belonged to the city all marble and cold air, and the particular indifference of downtown Chicago in the early morning. But by the time you reached 18, something shifted. The carpet was older here, the lighting softer, and the air carried the faint smell of coffee and paper that accumulates only in offices where someone has actually worked for a long time. I had been walking these hallways for 25 years. I knew where the 3rd floor tile was loose, and I knew that Elias always left his door cracked in the morning because the old ventilation system ran hot on the east side. The door was cracked. I knocked anyway. He turned from the window when he heard me. In 25 years of friendship, I had learned to read Elias Vance by the way he held his shoulders. And that morning, his shoulders were doing something I had only seen once before, at his wife's funeral 11 years ago. They were carrying something invisible and very heavy. Benedict, he said, just my name, nothing after it. I know, I said. Sit down and tell me from the beginning. He did. Elias was 63 years old, 18 years a partner at the firm, the kind of attorney who had built a career on precision and discretion. He was not a man who made errors. But 12 years ago, a long-term client, a widow in her 70s, sharp-minded but frightened of the probate process, had asked him to make a small adjustment to her late husband's will. A minor reallocation of a secondary bequest. Nothing that changed the principal heirs. Nothing that the family had contested. He had done it, filed it, and moved on. The widow had passed 4 years later. The estate had settled without incident. Until 3 months ago, when Caleb had somehow obtained a copy of the original draft and the filed version and identified the discrepancy. He came to my office, Elias said. He was seated now, his hands around a coffee mug he wasn't drinking from. He was very calm. That was the part I keep thinking about. He laid the 2 documents on my desk, and he didn't raise his voice once. He paused. He said he needed information about your assets, your schedule, your habits at the villa. He said if I cooperated, the documents would stay private. If I didn't. He stopped. You don't need to finish that sentence, I said. Illinois Rule of Professional Conduct. 8.4 makes it a disciplinary offense for an attorney to engage in conduct involving dishonesty or misrepresentation. The adjustment Elias had made even at a client's explicit request, even without harmful intent, fell within the range of conduct that the Attorney Registration and Disciplinary Commission could act on. A formal complaint, even one that was ultimately dismissed, would be sufficient to damage a career built on 30 years of reputation. Caleb had understood that. He had found the exact pressure point and applied exactly enough weight. I sat across from Elias and said nothing for a long moment. I had spent 40 years in investigative work, and one of the first things you learn in that profession is that silence applied correctly is a more useful instrument than any question. People who are carrying something will put it down if you give them enough room and enough quiet. Elias put it down. He told me everything, the dates of the meetings, the specific information Caleb had requested the channel he used to pass it along. As I listened, I sorted each piece into categories: operational details, asset information, behavioral patterns. I cross-referenced it against what I knew Caleb would need to move against me effectively. When Elias finished, I asked the only question that mattered. How much has he actually received from you? Elias listed it. I listened carefully. My schedule partially accurate. My general asset categories publicly available from tax documents. The location of the main collection room, something Caleb could have learned from a casual visit. Nothing about the collection's authentication system. Nothing about the secondary storage areas. Nothing about the name of my estate attorney or the structure of my trust documentation. It was the information of a man who had been frightened into cooperating, but who had consciously or not given away only what he could bear to give. I stood up. I walked to the window and stood beside him, both of us looking down at the street below. The morning commute still moving through the loop. Taxis and delivery trucks, and the particular purposeful chaos of a city that does not acknowledge its own exhaustion. Good, I said. Then you'll keep giving him what he wants to hear. But from now on, it will be what I want him to hear. Elias turned to look at me. I could see him working through it, the logic. The risk, the specific shape of what I was asking. You will no longer be his hostage, I said. You will be my weapon. He was quiet for a moment, then carefully, Are you certain about this? He is your son, Benedict. I kept my eyes on the street below. A woman in a red coat was crossing against the light unhurried, as if the traffic had agreed to wait for her. The son I raised, I said, would never put his hands on his father's shoulders to measure when they might give way. Elias did not answer. He didn't need to. He nodded once slowly, the way a man nods when he has been given something to hold on to. I checked my watch on the way to the elevator. 2 hours. I had a second meeting, different building, different floor, a person I had not mentioned to Elias and would not mention to anyone yet. This was not a matter of trust in the way that Elias and I trusted each other with history and shared years and the accumulated weight of knowing someone's character. This was something more specific than trust. This was capability. And I needed a particular kind of capability for what was coming next. The leaves on Michigan Avenue had gone fully red by the third week of October. I noticed them through the window of the coffee shop the moment I turned the corner, a long row of maples running the length of the block, burning against a gray afternoon sky the way they only do for about 10 days each year before the wind takes them. I had lived in Chicago long enough to know that when the maples went red like that, the cold was no longer a possibility. It was a promise. He was already inside. Dominic Thorne was 45 years old, though he carried the age the way certain men do, not heavily, but with a kind of settled density as if the years had compressed rather than accumulated. He was lean with the posture of someone who had spent a long time in rooms where the exits mattered, and eyes that moved in the particular way I had learned to recognize in people whose profession required them to see what others missed. He was seated at a corner table with his back to the wall, which I had expected. On the table in front of him were 2 cups of coffee, both untouched, both long cold. He had arrived early, and he had waited, and the 2 cold cups were his way of telling me he had done both without complaint. I had known Dominic for 11 years. We had worked together on 3 fraud investigations during my time at Great Lakes Insurance complex cases involving asset concealment forged documentation, and the kind of institutional deception that requires someone who understands both the law and the specific ways people choose to circumvent it. Dominic occupied a professional category that had no clean title part, financial forensics part, cybersecurity part, something that courtrooms preferred not to name directly. He was not a private investigator in any formal sense. He was the person you called when what you needed could not be obtained through channels that appeared on a business card. I sat down across from him. He didn't say hello. He said, "You lost weight. I've had a difficult month. Tell me." I told him everything. I laid it out the way I had learned to lay out evidence over 40 years chronologically, without editorializing, beginning with Stuart Mead's visit and the briefcase that never touched the floor, moving through Caleb's phone and the photographs he had taken of each stamp, then Elias and the blackmail and the information that had already changed hands. Dominic listened without writing anything down, which was another habit. I recognize people who are genuinely processing do not need to take notes in the moment. When I finished, he was quiet for a few seconds. Then he asked the only question that mattered. Do you want to protect yourself, or do you want to destroy him? I picked up one of the cold coffees. Both, I said, in the right order. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite a smile, but the specific look of a man who has been given a problem he finds genuinely interesting. He leaned forward. The device in Mead's briefcase, he said, based on what you described, the profile, the weight distribution, the angle Mead kept it at, it's an electronic lock scanner. Close-range BGP frequency capture. It reads the signal signature of electronic combination systems without physical contact. He paused. Whoever sent Mead didn't just want to know what's in your safe. They wanted to know how to open it, which means the collection is the next target. The collection is the first target, Dominic said. Everything else comes after the house, the accounts, the legal arrangements, but the stamps are immediate, portable, valuable. And in a space they now have the technical means to access. He reached into his jacket and set a small notebook on the table, the kind you find in hardware stores, unlined, spiral bound. He opened it to a blank page and wrote 3 words in a column: financial, legal, digital. 3 traps, he said, running in sequence, each one building on the last. He tapped the first word. We replaced the collection with reproductions precise enough to pass initial examination. Caleb takes them, sells them, and in doing so generates documented evidence of theft and fraud, evidence that originates from his own actions, not from anything we manufacture. He moved to the second. Your attorney continues feeding Caleb information, but only what we script. We control what he believes he knows. He tapped the third. We build him something to put the money into, something that looks legitimate from the outside and is a controlled container on the inside. I looked at the 3 words. I had spent 4 decades chasing fraud schemes that operated on exactly this architecture-layered structures, where each component appeared independent but served a single outcome. I recognized the construction the way a carpenter recognizes a joint that has been cut correctly. How long? I asked. 3 months minimum, possibly 4. He looked at me steadily. And during that time, you behave exactly as a man who suspects nothing. You answer Caleb's calls. You have dinner with him if he asks. You give him no reason to accelerate. I've spent 40 years interviewing people who were lying to me, I said. 3 more months isn't a problem. He nodded. Then his expression settled into something more serious. There is one thing I need you to understand before we go any further. He held my gaze. Once this begins, once the first trap is set, there is no version of this that ends quietly. Not for him. Not for her. You need to be clear about that before I make a single call. I looked out the window at the red maples on Michigan Avenue. I am clear, I said. He picked up his cold coffee and finally drank it. There's one component we're still missing, he said, setting the cup down. The reproductions. They need to be precise enough that a knowledgeable buyer accepts them without question. That requires a very specific kind of craftsman. He paused. I know someone in Philadelphia. He doesn't advertise and he doesn't come cheap. How long? 3 weeks to produce what we need. I put on my coat and stood. Outside, a gust moved through the maples and a sheet of red leaves crossed the window in a slow diagonal. Then make the call, I said. 3 weeks after Michigan Avenue, Dominic left a wooden box on my doorstep at 11:30 at night. No note, no knock. By the time I heard the faint sound of a car pulling away from the curb and opened the front door, the street was empty. The box was the size of a shoebox cedar with a small brass latch. I carried it inside without opening it and set it on the work table in the collection room. Then I made coffee, sat down, and looked at it for 20 minutes. At 2 a.m, I opened the latch. Inside, nested in black velvet cutouts, were 31 stamps. I had spent 30 years acquiring originals. I knew what genuine philatelic work looked like under magnification, the specific texture of period-correct paper stock, the ink saturation variations that come from hand-operated printing equipment, the natural aging patterns that forgers almost always got slightly wrong in the gum or the perforation edges. I had, over the course of my career, identified 11 forged stamps submitted as evidence in insurance fraud cases. These were the best false documents I had ever held. The informant Dominic used was a man who had spent 12 years producing fraudulent currency and high-value collectibles before cooperating with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit. He now operated under a supervised agreement his particular skills occasionally made available for. Controlled operations that required a level of forgery expertise no legitimate craftsman could provide. He had worked on our reproductions for 3 weeks without a day off, and looking at the results under my loupe, I understood why Dominic had said he didn't come cheap. I set the loupe down and began. I worked from left to right case by case the way I had always moved through a collection, methodically without rushing. I opened the first display case and lifted the 1918 inverted Jenny from its archival mount with cotton gloves and a pair of museum-grade tongs. I held the original for a moment. Then I placed it carefully into a sleeve of acid-free mylar and set it in a separate tray. Into the mount, I placed the reproduction. Under the display lighting, there was no visible difference. I worked for 2 hours. The room was quiet except for the wind off Lake Michigan pressing against the north-facing windows, a low, persistent sound, like something leaning its weight against the glass and deciding not to break through. I did not play music. I did not turn on the overhead lights. The single desk lamp threw a warm circle across the work table, and I moved within it stamp by stamp, and I let myself remember. Margaret had been the one who found the Columbian Exposition block at a small estate sale in Evanston in 1997. She had spotted it in a shoebox under a folding table priced at $8, and had carried it across the room to me with the calm expression of a woman who knew exactly what she had found, and was choosing not to let anyone else in the room know it. We had paid the $8 and driven home in near silence, the shoebox on her lap. And somewhere on the Edens Expressway, she had started laughing and hadn't stopped until we were pulling into the driveway. That block was in the third case from the left. I moved it last. By 3:45 in the morning, every display case held a reproduction. Every original was in a mylar sleeve inside the cedar box. I closed the lid and carried it downstairs. The basement of the villa ran the full footprint of the house. I had designed it myself when the building was constructed 22 years ago, in consultation with the contractor, and without explaining every detail of what I wanted. Along the east wall, behind the furnace unit and within a section of the original plumbing infrastructure that had been sealed when I upgraded the system in 2009, there was a section of pipe housing that did not connect to anything. From the outside, it was indistinguishable from the surrounding infrastructure, the same oxidized copper fittings, the same bracket spacing the same pipe diameter. To open it, you pressed the second bracket from the left at a specific angle and held it for 4 seconds. The mechanism released with a sound like a breath. Inside was a steel compartment 14 inches by 20 with an electronic keypad. I set the cedar box into the compartment and entered the combination. The keypad accepted it without a sound. I had chosen the number 22 years ago when the house was new, and Margaret was still here to help me decide things, the date of our wedding anniversary. June 7th, 1971. June 7th, 71. I stood in the basement with my hand on the closed door of the compartment. "I'm sorry," I said. My voice was flat in the low-ceiling space. "I'm sorry for using what we built together as bait. I want you to know I understand what that costs." I paused. "I'll bring them back." I stood there a moment longer. Then I went upstairs. The collection room looked exactly as it always had. 30 years of apparent accumulation, correctly lit, correctly mounted, correctly labeled. A room that said nothing has changed here. I turned off the desk lamp and stood in the near dark looking at the display cases. "Now we wait," I said to no one. My phone vibrated on the work table, a message from Dominic. Sent at 3:12 in the morning, the exchange is live. Elias drops the name next week. I read it twice. Then I looked up at the wall above the central case where Margaret's portrait had hung for 16 years, a photograph taken in the Berkshires in 1989. The year before, we moved to Chicago when her hair was still dark and she was laughing at something the photographer had said. I had never asked her what it was. I nodded at the photograph. Slowly, The way you nod at someone across a room when words aren't the right instrument. The phone rang at 9 the following morning. The name on the screen was Caleb. I answered on the second ring. Dad. His voice was warm, careful, textured, with exactly the right amount of concern. Just checking in. How are you feeling? You sounded tired when we spoke last week. I told him I was fine. I told him I had slept well. I told him the collection room needed some cleaning, and I had been spending time in there. He said that sounded like me. He said he was glad I had something to keep me busy. He said he'd try to visit soon if things at work settled down. We talked for 6 minutes. I counted. When I ended the call, I set the phone face down on the kitchen table and looked at the wall. You're performing well, Caleb. The thought arrived without anger, just the particular exhausted recognition of a man who had spent a career watching people play roles they had not been cast for. But I have seen this production before. I just watched it from the other side of the stage. There was no sign on the door of the 12th floor. That was the first thing I had noticed when Dominic moved his operation here 3 weeks earlier. No nameplate, no suite number. No indication of what the room contained or who used it. Just a door the same color as the wall on either side of it, easy to walk past if you didn't know to stop. I had spent enough years tracking people who didn't want to be found to recognize the deliberate quality of that invisibility. I knocked twice. He opened it before the second knock finished. The room was dark except for the screens. 3 monitors arranged in a tight arc cast everything in pale blue Dominic's face. His hands moving across the keyboard, the stacks of equipment along the far wall. There were no overhead lights on. I had learned that this was not affectation. Dominic worked in low light because it reduced eye strain during the long sessions that were simply a feature of what he did. On the central monitor filling most of the screen was a website interface I had seen only in outline form before. I stood in the doorway and looked at it. Vaultex Digital Exchange, Secure Precious Metals Trading. A professional header in muted gold and charcoal. A live market ticker running across the top. Portfolio dashboards. Client testimonials. A compliance disclosure footer. It looked precisely like what it was pretending to be, the kind of mid-tier investment platform that appeared routinely in the financial press and catered to clients who considered themselves sophisticated enough to move beyond conventional brokerage accounts. I had to look carefully to remember that I had helped build it. Sit, Dominic said. He did not look up from the keyboard. I sat. He pulled the central monitor slightly toward me and began walking through the architecture the way a contractor walks a client through a completed structure before the final inspection. 18 months of backdated transaction history, he said. Synthetic but internally consistent account openings, deposit cycles, withdrawal patterns, quarterly returns. If someone runs a longitudinal audit on the platform's public data, the numbers hold. He moved to the next screen. 3 letters of endorsement from legitimate financial organizations, 2 regional investment newsletters, and a small advisory firm in Columbus that I have a prior working relationship with. None of them know the full context. They know only that they were asked to evaluate a platform and provide a written assessment, which they did. And Elias, Dominic clicked to a 3rd tab. Layer 2, the referral. He turned to look at me for the first time since I had entered. This is the component that makes the other 2 layers function. On its own, an 18-month history and 3 endorsements are good. For a careful stockbroker, they might be enough to warrant a small test investment. But a referral from a trusted source, someone whose judgment Caleb has reason to believe is uncompromised, someone he thinks he controls, I said. Someone he thinks he controls? Dominic agreed. That converts cautious interest into confidence. Elias mentioned Vaultex to him 4 days ago, framed it as something a high net worth client had discussed in passing a platform, delivering above market returns on precious metals positions. He expressed no personal opinion. He simply let the information exist in the conversation. I understood the mechanics. In my years investigating insurance fraud, I had studied the psychology of financial deception extensively, not because I had ever intended to use it, but because understanding how people were deceived was the only reliable way to identify when it was happening. The most effective manipulation does not push. It simply places something within reach and allows the target to convince themselves. And the 3rd layer, I said. Dominic pulled up a new dashboard. 23% return in the first 30 days on an initial deposit of $50,000. $11,500 credited to his account at the end of the month. He paused. Do you want to know why 23? You're going to tell me regardless. Something close to a smile crossed his face. I spent 2 years working financial intelligence cases involving what the FBI classifies as pig butchering scams. The term comes from the Chinese sha zhu pan, the practice of fattening a pig before slaughter. The structure is consistent. Establish trust, introduce an investment opportunity, show early gains to build confidence, encourage escalating deposits, then disappear with the accumulated funds. He leaned back. The critical variable is the initial return percentage, too low, and the target doesn't feel the urgency to move quickly. Too high, and a financially literate person becomes suspicious. The range that consistently performs the number that is large enough to activate greed, but small enough to survive scrutiny from someone with professional training sits between 19 and 26%. 23 is the midpoint. 23 is the point at which, in documented case, studies the decision to escalate deposits occurred fastest among targets with financial industry backgrounds. He looked at me steadily. I did not choose it arbitrarily. I chose it because I know what it does to a person who is already desperate and already looking for a reason to believe. I sat with that for a moment. Caleb was a Series 7 licensed stockbroker. He understood market mechanics, risk ratios, the mathematics of returns. Under normal circumstances, a 23% monthly return would trigger the professional skepticism his training had built. But Caleb's circumstances were not normal. He had already committed to a financial path that had no clean exit, the Delaware LLCs, whatever funds he had moved through them, whatever debts he had accumulated in building the life he and Valeria had constructed together. A man who is already in the water does not debate whether the rope is real. He grabs it. When the platform closes, I said, what happens to the money? Every transaction is logged under FBI monitoring through the passive oversight Kellerman authorized. When we move to the active phase, the funds are frozen and transferred to a federal evidence account. Any money Caleb deposited that can be traced to fraudulent sources, money obtained through means we haven't yet fully documented. He paused. That becomes recoverable in civil proceedings as well as criminal. And the timing. He looked at me with the directness that I had come to understand was his version of emphasis. When you tell me to close it. Before I could respond, a soft alert tone came from the left monitor. Dominic turned. I watched his expression, which was as always largely unreadable, settle into something I had learned to interpret as confirmation. He turned the monitor toward me. On the screen was a real-time activity dashboard. A new account entry had appeared in the past 4 minutes. The deposit figure beside it read $50,000. He took the first step, Dominic said. I looked at the number on the screen. $50,000 moving through a platform that did not exist into an account that was being watched by the FBI. My son, walking toward a door I had built and unlocked and left standing open. I did not feel satisfaction. I am not certain what I felt. Something older and heavier than satisfaction, the particular weight of being right about something you had spent months hoping you were wrong about. 2 weeks later, Dominic called me at 7 a.m. Not a message this time, a call. I need you to come in, he said. There's money moving through the platform that doesn't match anything we've accounted for. It's not from Caleb's brokerage accounts. It's not from his personal savings. A pause. I don't know yet where it's coming from. But, Benedict, it's a significant amount. I put on my coat and drove downtown before the city had fully woken up. The report arrived in a plain manila envelope slid under the front door sometime before 5 a.m. I found it when I came downstairs at 6:15, still in my robe moving toward the kitchen, on the particular autopilot of a man who has not been sleeping well. I almost stepped over it. The envelope had no return address, no stamps, no markings of any kind, except my name written in Dominic's compressed, precise handwriting. I had seen that handwriting on legal pads and sticky notes for 11 years. I knew what it looked like when he had written something quickly, and I knew what it looked like when he had written something carefully. This was careful. I made coffee before I opened it. That was deliberate. 40 years of investigative work had taught me that the moment before you read something you cannot unread deserves whatever small ritual you can give it. I filled the mug, set it on the kitchen table, sat down and placed the envelope in front of me. Outside the window above the sink, the Chicago sky was the particular gray of pre-dawn November flat without depth, the color of something waiting. I opened the envelope. Inside were 11 pages printed organized with the quiet precision that characterized everything Dominic produced. a cover sheet, 3 sections, numbered exhibits. I had read thousands of investigative reports over the course of my career, and I recognized immediately that this one had been structured for a specific purpose, not just to inform, but to document. This was not a memo. This was a file prepared with eventual legal presentation in mind. I began to read. The first section was familiar territory, a summary of Vaultex activity for the preceding week account deposits transaction routing. I moved through it quickly. The second section was where I slowed down. 3 client account profiles, real names, not Caleb's names, not anyone I recognized. 1 retired teacher from Oak Park, 1 small business owner from Naperville, 1 woman in her late 60s from the north side of the city, a widow who had trusted a licensed financial advisor with money she had spent 30 years accumulating. Caleb had been their licensed financial advisor. The third section laid out the mechanics column by column, the way an auditor would present findings to a compliance board. 14 months of incremental withdrawals, small enough per transaction to avoid automatic audit flags, consistent enough in pattern to constitute deliberate systematic theft. Adjusted commission entries, phantom management fees. The kind of manipulation that required ongoing access professional knowledge, and the specific confidence of someone who believed he would never be caught. Total, across all 3 accounts, $281,400. I set the report down. I sat in my kitchen in the early morning light and looked at the wall where my family photographs had always hung. There were 4 of them frame prints in a loose arrangement that Margaret had organized the year we moved in, and that I had not changed since. My eye went to the one on the far left. A snapshot from a summer afternoon in 1994, the 3 of us at a park on the North Shore. Caleb was 10 years old. He was on my shoulders laughing at something out of frame, his hands gripping the sides of my head, like a child who has not yet learned that heights are something to be afraid of. I reached up and turned it face down against the wall. Not from anger. I want to be precise about that. It was not anger. It was the same reason you close a case file before making a difficult phone call, because there are things you cannot hold in the same hand at the same time. I called Dominic at 7:15. He picked up on the first ring, which told me he had been awake. "You read it," he said. "All of it." I kept my voice level. "Wire fraud, securities fraud, the federal charges on both counts," he said. "The interstate wire transfers alone are enough for the U.S. Attorney's Office to open a separate indictment independent of anything related to you. Caleb has built a case against himself that has nothing to do with your collection, your house, or your family." A pause. "I've already forwarded the documentation to Kellerman." I looked at the report on the table in front of me. 11 pages that represented 14 months of harm to 3 people who had done nothing except trust a man, with a professional license and a photograph of himself shaking hands with someone important on his office wall. "The teacher from Oak Park," I said. "How much? 94,000? I did not say anything for a moment. "The woman on the north side, the widow, just over 112,000. I had spent 40 years reconstructing financial crimes after the fact, arriving at the scene after the damage was done, trying to establish what had happened and who was responsible. In that work, there is a professional distance that is not coldness, but necessity. You cannot be effective if every case becomes personal. This was personal. Dominic. I chose my next words carefully. When is he planning to complete the stamp transaction? He's been in contact with a private auction broker in the Gold Coast, a small firm that handles discrete transactions for high-value collectibles. No public listings. No paper trail through the major houses. A brief pause. The exchange is scheduled for 3 weeks from now. He's expecting to receive between $600,000 and $700,000 in a private wire transfer. For 30 years of forgeries good enough to fool anyone who wasn't looking closely enough. Let it happen, I said. Let him make the sale. Let him receive every dollar. And I want a complete record of exactly where that money goes from the moment it lands in his account. Already arranged. I stood up from the kitchen table and walked to the window. The first snow of the season had begun during the night, not heavy. Just a light preliminary dusting on the back garden and the bare branches of the oak tree Margaret had planted the year we bought the house. It would not stick. It was too early for that. But it was the announcement of what was coming. "Dominic," I said, "when the platform closes and the money is gone, what do you think he does next?" He was quiet for a beat. "He comes to you. He has nowhere else to go." "That's what I think as well." I watched a thin line of snow move along the oak branch outside and release into the air. Let's start building the next phase. I want everything in place before he arrives at my door. We ended the call. I refilled my coffee, sat back down, and looked at the turned-over photograph on the wall. After a moment, I picked up the 11 pages and read the second section again, the 3 client profiles. The numbers, the names of people who did not know yet that someone was at this very moment trying to get them their money back. That night, I could not sleep. I told myself it was the case, the weight of what I had read that morning, the particular exhaustion that comes not from physical effort, but from sustained, concentrated moral clarity. Around 2 in the morning, I got up to get a glass of water. In the hallway between the bedroom and the kitchen, something happened that I had not experienced before. The room moved. Not dramatically, not the lurching disorientation of serious vertigo. More like a slow, gentle rotation, as if the floor had decided to reconsider its angle by 3 degrees and then thought better of it. It lasted perhaps 4 seconds. I put my hand on the wall and waited, and it passed. I stood in the hallway for a moment. Stress, I thought. 68 years old, not enough sleep. Too much caffeine, a month of sustained tension. I drank. The water went back to bed, and lay in the dark, listening to the wind move through the oak tree in the garden. I thought it was exhaustion. I was wrong. It took me 14 days to stop blaming myself. 14 days of waking at 3 in the morning, with my heart moving faster than it should. Of standing in the kitchen, waiting for the coffee to brew, and losing the thread of what I had been thinking about. Of sitting down at my desk, with a document in front of me, and realizing, 10 minutes later, that I had read the same paragraph 4 times, without retaining a single word. I had attributed it to the sustained weight of what I was carrying. The particular cognitive tax of maintaining a performance for weeks on end, while simultaneously managing a complex investigation. I was 68 years old. I was under more pressure than I had been in a decade. The math seemed obvious. Then one morning in early December, I was standing in the bedroom doorway pulling on my jacket when something connected. Not a dramatic realization, not a flash of insight, just a quiet, lateral thought of the kind that surfaces when a mind trained for 40 years, in pattern recognition, finally has enough data to work with. The first night I had felt the dizziness, the slow 3-degree rotation that had passed in 4 seconds and left me standing in the hallway with my hand on the wall, had been a Thursday. I went back through my mental calendar. The previous Sunday, Caleb and Valeria had come to the villa. The stated purpose had been to help me organize the storage room in the east wing, a task I had not requested and did not particularly need. Valeria had brought cleaning supplies. Caleb had spent 40 minutes in the back of the house while she worked in the kitchen. I stood in the bedroom doorway for a moment. Then I called Dominic. He arrived 2 hours later with a case I had not seen before, longer than his usual equipment aluminum, with a combination lock on each latch. He opened it on the kitchen table without explaining its contents and began assembling a handheld device that looked to my eye like a modified signal analyzer. And this reads electromagnetic frequency emissions across a wider band than standard RF detectors. He said, running a calibration sequence. If there's anything in this house producing a signal it shouldn't be producing, this will find it. We started in the bedroom. He moved slowly, holding the device at wall height, watching the readout display. I followed a few feet behind. In my years of investigative work, I had participated in evidence searches, methodical, unhurried, the kind of patience that produces results precisely because it refuses to rush. This felt familiar. What was not familiar was doing it in my own home. The device registered nothing in the north wall, nothing in the south. Along the east wall, the one that backed against the closet, the readout remained flat. Then Dominic moved to the section of wall beside the window, where 2 standard electrical outlets were mounted at baseboard height, and the display changed. He stopped. He looked at the number on the screen. He looked at me. "Step back," he said quietly. He crouched and examined the lower outlet. After a moment, he produced a flathead screwdriver and removed the cover plate. Behind it was not the standard junction box and wiring I would have expected. There was a secondary housing, a thin matte black unit approximately the size of a deck of cards, fitted between the drywall and the original electrical infrastructure with a precision that suggested it had been installed by someone who knew what they were doing. Dominic did not touch it. "Infrasound emitter," he said. "Low-frequency acoustic device. Operates below the threshold of human hearing. You cannot hear it, but your nervous system responds to it. Prolonged exposure produces sleep disruption, mild spatial disorientation. difficulty with short-term memory, and sustained concentration. He replaced the outlet cover carefully, exactly as it had been. Used long enough to anyone observing from outside, the symptoms are indistinguishable from early-stage cognitive decline. I looked at the outlet cover on the wall. How long has it been running? Based on the battery indicator, I could see at least 5 weeks. 5 weeks. Since the Sunday Caleb and Valeria had come to help with the storage room. Leave it exactly where it is, I said. Dominic nodded. He had anticipated this. If we remove it, we alert them that it's been found and we lose the physical evidence. Who installed it? Caleb doesn't have the technical knowledge for this. Dominic replaced the screwdriver in his case. His name is Marcus Holt, former private security, now freelance surveillance work, the kind of contractor that doesn't appear in any licensed directory. Caleb has been using him to monitor the villa for approximately 2 months. I identified him through a vehicle registration that appeared 3 times in a 2-week period near your property. A pause. Holt also submitted a report to Caleb last week, indicating he had found nothing unusual during a sweep of the house. I filed the name away without comment. In 40 years of investigative work, I had learned that a man who can be hired to watch someone can, under the right circumstances, be persuaded to watch someone else. Marcus Holt was a variable I intended to keep in reserve, which means he didn't find our camera. He used a standard RF detector and an optical lens finder, Dominic said. Neither would detect the thermal imaging unit in the portrait frame. The housing has a thin lead composite outer layer that absorbs RF emissions, and the sensor only activates in response to body heat. It produces no signal when no one is present. This is the same concealment technology the FBI's Special Operations Group uses for long-term residential surveillance. He looked at me. Holt was thorough by normal standards. Our equipment operates above normal standards. That afternoon, I drove to the federal building on West Roosevelt Road. Agent Rebecca Torres ran the Elder Abuse Financial Crimes Unit out of the Chicago field office, a different division from Agent Kellerman, who had been managing the financial fraud monitoring. The two had already been in contact. Kellerman had forwarded my file to Torres 3 weeks earlier, when the scope of what Caleb was doing had expanded beyond securities fraud into what Torres's unit handled. She was 43, precise in the way that people who deal with irreversible harm tend to become precise. And she had read the documentation before I arrived. I told her about the infrasound device. I told her about Marcus Holt and the surveillance. I told her about the camera footage that had been accumulating in the portrait frame in my collection room since October. I need a Title III court order, I said. One for everything already recorded and everything that will be recorded going forward. She was quiet for a moment, reviewing the file in front of her. Title III of the Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act governs the interception of wire, oral, and electronic communications. A court order under Title III means that any evidence collected through the authorized surveillance is obtained under judicial oversight. It cannot be challenged as illegally gathered, and it carries the full weight of federal admissibility in any subsequent prosecution. The footage you already have, she said carefully, was recorded in your own home with your own equipment. That has a reasonable argument for admissibility on its own. But with a Title III order, there's no argument, I said. She looked at me for a moment. Mr. Lawrence, I want you to understand what we're building here. Between the financial crimes documentation, the wire fraud, the elder abuse evidence, and now the criminal installation of a surveillance device in your residence. She paused. When this file is complete, there is no defense attorney in this country who is going to find an exit. That, I said, is exactly what I need. She submitted the application that afternoon. I drove home in the early evening dark through streets that had begun to carry the particular silence of Chicago in December, the cold that doesn't announce itself, but simply arrives and stays. That night, I did not look at the camera footage from the collection room. I had set the system to record continuously, and I knew there would be material to review. But I made dinner, read for an hour, and went to bed at a reasonable time for the first time in weeks. The following morning, with coffee, I opened the footage on my laptop and began to review the overnight recording from the camera in the portrait frame. I watched for 11 minutes. Then I set the laptop on the table, pushed back my chair, and sat very still for a long moment before I trusted myself to stand up. Before I show you what those cameras recorded, comment the number 9 below so I know you're still here with me. A gentle reminder. The story ahead contains fictional elements added for narrative and educational purposes. Some details may not reflect any single event, if that's not what you're looking for. It's completely fine to step away here. I have opened a great many envelopes in my life that I already knew in some part of myself I was not going to like. Insurance fraud files with numbers that didn't add up. Legal correspondence with return addresses that meant bad news. Medical reports where the cover page alone told you enough. Over 40 years you develop a particular relationship with those moments, not a tolerance for them exactly, but a kind of practiced steadiness. You learn to sit with the thing before you open it. You learn to breathe first. I sat in my upstairs study in the gray morning light with the laptop open in front of me and applied every bit of that practice to the next 30 seconds. Then I pressed play. The footage was organized chronologically, 23 separate clips, each time stamped. Each captured by the thermal imaging camera Dominic had installed in the hallway junction outside the master bedroom in the 48 hours following our discovery of the infrasound device. The installation had been covered under the Title III court order Agent Torres had obtained. Every frame was legally captured. Every frame was admissible. I watched the first clip. 2:14 in the morning. The hallway rendered in the pale green of thermal imaging empty. Then, a shape moving from the direction of the guest room, human-sized upright, unhurried. It moved to the door of my bedroom. It opened the door without hesitation, which told me it had done this before the cameras were installed. It crossed to the ensuite bathroom where I kept my medications. The figure stood at the cabinet for 31 seconds. Then it retreated back down the hallway. The timestamp on the second clip was 3 days later. Same hallway, same figure, same cabinet. 38 seconds. I watched all 23. The motion was identical across every clip, not the careful movement of someone afraid of being caught, but the routine efficiency of someone who had done the same thing enough times that it had become ordinary. 23 visits across 6 weeks, all between 1:45 and 2:30 in the morning, all following the same path, all ending at the same cabinet. I closed the laptop. I picked up my phone and called Dominic. When he answered, I read him the name on my blood pressure prescription, the medication I had been taking for 4 years, the one I refilled every 3 months at the same pharmacy on North Michigan, the one that sat in a dark amber bottle in my bathroom cabinet behind the mirrored door. I heard him typing. He was quiet for a moment. Amlodipine bisalate, he said. 5 milligrams, standard calcium channel, blocker common prescription unremarkable appearance. The tablet is small white round. Another pause. If someone wanted to substitute it with something that would pass a visual inspection by the patient, they would need a tablet that matched those specifications. He paused again longer this time. Furosemide, 40 milligrams white round. A loop diuretic aggressively eliminates fluid and electrolytes, common enough to be purchased in bulk, visually close enough to amlodipine that most patients wouldn't notice the difference, especially in low light, especially if they were already experiencing the cognitive effects of 5 weeks of infrasound exposure. I said nothing. Combined with the acoustic device, Dominic continued, his voice very even. The presentation would be consistent with accelerating kidney dysfunction, confusion, fatigue, spatial disorientation, irregular heart rhythm. To any physician evaluating you without the full context, he stopped. To anyone looking from outside, it would appear that your health was declining rapidly and unpredictably. I sat with that for a moment. Then I drove to Dr. Alan Frost's clinic on West Belmont Avenue. Alan Frost had been my physician for 15 years. He was 61, methodical, the kind of doctor who read the literature and remembered what he read. We had over a decade and a half developed the particular relationship that forms between two people who have discussed mortality enough times that it no longer carries the weight of a taboo. He was not easily surprised. He was. However, when I finished telling him what I had found very still for a longer moment than I had expected, he ran a blood panel and a renal function screen. While we waited for the results, he removed the amber bottle from the paper bag I had brought from home and examined the contents under the light on his desk. He took one tablet out and placed it on a white surface. He looked at it for some time. "This is not amlodipine," he said. The blood results confirmed what Dominic had already described. Electrolyte imbalance consistent with diuretic use. No permanent renal damage. The substitution had been underway for approximately 2 weeks, not long enough for lasting harm. But the trajectory was clear. Another month on furosemide at this dosage, in combination with the sleep deprivation the infrasound had been producing, and the clinical picture would have been genuinely alarming. I asked him for two things. The first was a written toxicological report documenting the substituted medication and the blood panel results, formal, dated, signed, suitable for submission as medical evidence in a federal proceeding. The second was more complicated. I need you to allow the perception to anyone who asks about my health in the coming weeks that my condition is worsening, I said. Not in writing, not on any official record. Simply, if Caleb or his wife calls to inquire, or if anyone contacts this office on their behalf, I need them to believe I am not doing well. Dr. Frost looked at me for a long moment. Benedict, I cannot falsify medical records. I'm not asking you to falsify anything. I'm asking you to exercise your right and my right as your patient to limit what information you share and with whom. My condition is real. The symptoms they caused are documented. What I am asking you not to do is volunteer the fact that I am now in possession of my actual medication and taking corrective measures. He was quiet for some time. Weekly check-ins, he said finally. You come to this office every 7 days. If at any point I determine there is a medical reason to override your request, I will do so without discussion. Those are my terms. Accepted. He signed the toxicological report while I sat across from him. Before I stood to leave, he set his pen down and looked at me directly. You understand that what you've shown me today constitutes deliberate poisoning of an elderly person, he said. Under Illinois statute, the act of substituting a patient's medication with the intent to cause harm is prosecutable as aggravated battery of a senior citizen, potentially as attempted murder, depending on how the intent is characterized. He paused. On this charge alone, we are discussing a minimum of 7 years. I put on my coat. I know, I said, but I need more than 7 years. He held my gaze for a moment. Then he nodded once and did not say anything further. I drove home in the thin December light. Inside, I went directly to the bathroom cabinet, removed the amber bottle Dominic had confirmed contained furosemide, and placed it back exactly as Valeria had left it, the label facing out the cap, tight the position, unchanged. Then I took the real prescription, Doctor. Frost had written me from my coat pocket and put it in my desk drawer behind the false bottom I had installed years ago for documents I needed to keep inaccessible to casual search. Tonight, when she came at 2 a.m, she would find everything exactly as she expected. I made dinner. I read for an hour. I went through the motions of the evening, the way a man does when he is performing steadiness rather than feeling it. At 7:45, I went to collect the mail. The envelope was at the bottom of the stack, standard size, no return address, my name, written in a hand I did not recognize. I opened it at the kitchen table. Inside was a single photograph, a legal document reduced to fit the page. I could read the header clearly. It referenced a trust instrument, an asset transfer, a beneficiary designation. I could read the signature line. My signature was on it. Full name dated 3 months ago, witnessed and notarized. I had never signed this document in my life. I have always done my best thinking at a kitchen table, not a desk. A desk is a place of performance where you sit upright and produce things. A kitchen table is where you actually work through what you cannot yet resolve, with something warm in front of you and the sounds of a house settling around you in the dark. Margaret had known this about me. When I came home from a difficult case and sat at the kitchen table after midnight, she would put a mug down beside me without asking and go back to bed. And I would stay there until the thing I was carrying had somewhere to rest. It was past midnight. The gas fireplace in the corner was running. I had stopped using the wood-burning one after Margaret. Passed because I could not manage both the fire and everything else, and outside the kitchen window. Chicago had gone below 0, the kind of cold that doesn't negotiate. I had made tea I wasn't drinking, and spread the contents of the plain envelope across the table, under the desk lamp I kept on the counter for exactly this kind of hour. 3 pages, legal formatting, standard trust instrument language in the body, the kind that attorneys produce in volume, and that means very little to most people who read it, but means everything when you understand what it authorizes. The Margaret Collins Ware Family Trust, established according to the backdated instrument 14 months before her death. Caleb named as sole trustee and sole beneficiary. Assets designated the primary residence at this address. All personal property of significant appraisal value, and listed in a separate rider attached to the back of the 3rd page the proceeds of a $2 million life insurance policy on Benedict Alton Lawrence, policy number on file with the issuing carrier. I set the 3rd page down and picked up the 2nd. Her signature was on the bottom of page 2, full name cursive, witnessed by a notary whose stamp I did not recognize, dated 4 months before she passed. I looked at it for a long time. In 30 years of marriage, I had watched Margaret sign her name on thousands of documents, insurance forms and lease agreements, and the backs of birthday cards, and the deed to this house, and the hospital consent forms in the last weeks when her hand was not steady. But her intention was, I knew her signature the way you know the sound of a voice that has been in the room with you for 3 decades. Not because you have memorized it, but because it has simply become part of the internal furniture of your life. The signature on page 2 was close. It was very close. Someone had studied the original carefully and produced something that would pass a routine verification, the proportions correct, the slant consistent, the spacing between letters preserved. But the M was wrong. Margaret had a small habit she had carried since childhood, a single extra upstroke at the beginning of her capital M, a tiny loop that served no function and that she had never been able to explain when I once asked about it. She had laughed and said her 3rd grade teacher had shown her, and it had never left. It appeared on every document she had signed in our marriage. It appeared on the birthday card she wrote me the year before she was diagnosed, which I still kept in the desk drawer upstairs. It did not appear on the signature on page 2. Whoever had made this had not known about the loop. I sat at the kitchen table in the warmth of the gas fire and looked at the forged signature of my dead wife on a document that would, if I had died without knowing it existed, have transferred everything I owned to the man who had recently pushed me down a flight of stairs. I did not cry. I want to be accurate about this. It is not that I prevented myself from crying. It is that the feeling that moved through me was not grief at that moment. It was something colder and more structural, the sensation of a 40-year investigator arriving at the final piece of an architecture and understanding completely what had been built. I looked up at the wall beside the refrigerator, where the photograph from the Berkshires hung, the one from 1989, Margaret laughing at something I couldn't see. Then I picked up my phone and called Dominic. It was 1:17 in the morning. He answered before the second ring. "Tell me," he said. "A trust instrument. Margaret's name on it backdated. He's the sole trustee and beneficiary. The life insurance policy is designated to the trust $2 million. I paused. "And the signature is forged. I can prove it." A silence. "Benedict. Activate the final phase," I said. Another silence longer. "You're certain, once I make these calls?" The sequence runs to conclusion. There is no point at which we pause. I looked at the photograph on the wall, at the way she was laughing with her whole face, at something I had never thought to ask about until it was too late. "I have been certain," I said, "since the day he put her name on that document." When I heard Dominic exhale, it was not a sound of relief. It was the sound of a man who had been holding a very precise thing in place for a long time and was now permitted to set it down. "I'll contact Torres first thing in the morning. The exchange closes in 10 days. After that," he stopped. "After that, it moves quickly." "Good," I said. I ended the call and stood up from the kitchen table. I walked to the window and looked out at Chicago in the dark, the streetlights catching the fine needles of blowing snow, the empty street below, the oak tree in the back garden that Margaret had planted the year we moved in, its bare branches traced in white. For the first time in months, the weight I had been carrying was not lighter, but it had found its correct shape. And a thing that has found its correct shape is something you can finally put down when the time comes. 10 days later, at 4:11 in the afternoon, Vaultex Digital Exchange went offline. The error message displayed to any user attempting to log in was generic and technical, the kind that suggested a server migration or a routine maintenance window. By the time Caleb would have understood what he was actually looking at, Agent Torres' team had already frozen the associated accounts. At 7:03 that evening, my phone rang. I looked at the screen. Caleb. I watched it ring 3 times. Then I set it face down on the kitchen table and waited. I had known he would call. I had known equally that a phone call was not what was coming next. A man who has just watched everything he built collapse in an afternoon does not stop at a phone call. He gets in his car. He drives to the only place left. The ceiling of the room was white. Not the warm white of a well-lit home, but the particular flat white of institutional spaces, the white of surfaces that are cleaned rather than chosen, that exist to reflect fluorescent light rather than to mean anything. I had been looking at it for what I estimated was about 40 minutes, though the morphine they had given me in the emergency department had done something unusual to my relationship with time. and I was not entirely certain of anything except the pain in my right side when I breathed and the sound of the cardiac monitor beside the bed, keeping its metronomic account of the fact that I was still alive. Northwestern Memorial, 7th floor. A private room that Dr. Frost had arranged before I had finished being evaluated in the ER. 3 months earlier, sitting across from Dominic in the office on West Monroe, I had said that I might end up in a hospital bed before this was finished. I had said it as a contingency, a possibility to plan, around not a certainty to welcome. Now, the 4th and 5th ribs on my right side were fractured. My left wrist had a hairline break at the distal radius, and I was learning in real time the difference between understanding something intellectually and living inside it. The pain was real. I want to be precise about this because it matters. I had planned for many things, but I had not planned to feel this specific. The sharp catch of breath when I shifted position. The particular nauseating ache that radiated from my side every time the mattress moved. I had read about rib fractures in medical reports over the years, had noted them in claims documentation, had cited them in evidence summaries. Reading about them and breathing around them are not the same experience. But I was not in this room as a victim. That distinction mattered too. They came at 2 in the afternoon on the second day. I heard Caleb's voice before I saw him in the corridor, speaking to a nurse with the calibrated concern of a devoted son, asking about my care plan and whether I was comfortable and whether there was anything the family should know. It was a practice register, the kind of tone you produce when you need the people around you to form a specific impression quickly. I had heard it thousands of times in 40 years of interviews. I had heard it most recently from across a kitchen table when he called to ask how I was sleeping. He came through the door first. Valeria followed. Caleb's face arranged itself into worry with the timing of someone who has rehearsed the expression, but not the feeling behind it. The brow slightly contracted, the eyes soft. The posture of a man carrying something heavy. He crossed to the bed and put his hand over mine on the blanket, and I let him, and I watched his eyes while he did it. Valeria stood 2 feet behind him. She was wearing a gray coat I had not seen before, and an expression of concern that was, if anything, more precise than Caleb's, not overdone, not theatrical. Just the exact correct measure of a woman worried about her father-in-law. It was excellent work. A person who did not know what I knew would have found it entirely convincing. I have spent 40 years reading people under pressure, not their words, but the smaller signals that words are designed to conceal. The quality of attention behind the eyes. The direction of the gaze when someone thinks you are not watching them. The micro pause between stimulus and response that reveals calculation rather than instinct. Both of them, in the 45 minutes they sat in that room, revealed themselves completely to anyone who knew what to look for. Caleb's eyes moved twice to the window ledge where my phone was charging, checking whether I had made calls or to whom. Valeria's attention shifted briefly but consistently to the IV line in my arm, not with medical concern, but with the focused assessment of someone calculating a timeline. They asked about my prognosis with the specific interest of people for whom the answer carries financial weight. I answered their questions. I told them the doctors were cautiously optimistic. I told them recovery would take time. I allowed my voice to carry a faint quality of confusion when they asked about the fall, not enough to be obvious, just enough to suggest that the sequence of events was not entirely clear to me. When they left, I lay in the white room and listened to the monitor and felt the pain in my ribs and thought about what comes after a trap is fully loaded. At 11:45 that night, the door to my room opened. Not the main door, the service entrance on the east wall, which connected to a supply corridor used by nursing staff during shift transitions. Dr. Frost had arranged access. Dominic came in, carrying nothing, no case, no equipment, just himself. In dark clothes, moving with the quiet efficiency of someone who had mapped the room before entering it. He pulled the visitor's chair to the side of the bed, sat down and leaned forward. "Everything is in place," he said, his voice barely above the threshold of the monitor's rhythm. "Torres has the full file: financial fraud, elder abuse, the medication substitution, the infrasound device, the forged trust instrument. The camera footage is certified under the Title III order. When we move with everything. What are we still missing?" He was quiet for a moment. "Direct evidence of conspiracy to commit murder. What we have now supports intent to harm and financial exploitation enough to arrest today, enough to convict on the financial counts. But a skilled defense attorney could negotiate those charges down to 6 or 7 years, maybe less with cooperation. For the elevated charges, the ones that remove any possibility of a reduced sentence, we need them to say it. or to do it in a context where we can prove it was planned. You arrest too early. You hand them a ceiling. You wait. You take the ceiling away entirely. I understood. The difference between what we had and what we needed was the difference between a case a skilled defense attorney could negotiate and a case that could not be negotiated at all. Well, then give them the opportunity, I said. Dominic looked at me steadily. You understand what that means. You will need to be in a position of apparent vulnerability, apparent incapacity for long enough that they make a move. And during that time, you trust everyone in our network completely. No margin. I looked at the ceiling for a moment, the white institutional ceiling with its fluorescent light and its utter indifference. I trusted the wrong person for 28 years, I said. Caleb has lived under this roof at my table in this family for his entire life. I paid for his education. I watched him graduate. I danced at his wedding. I paused. This time, I am trusting people who have given me reasons to. That is a different calculation entirely. Dominic nodded once. He stood, returned the chair to its position, and crossed back to the service entrance. 3 days, he said. Then you go home, and we begin the last phase. He left the way he had come, without sound. 3 days later, I walked out of Northwestern Memorial with a discharge summary, a prescription for pain management, and 4 cracked bones that would remind me of January for the rest of my life. And I began to be weaker. Not in fact in appearance, slower on the stairs, more hesitant at the door, occasionally pausing in the middle of a sentence as if I had lost the thread. Caleb and Valeria, who had begun calling every other day to check on me, heard it in my voice, and I could feel through the phone. The particular quality of attention that sharpens in people when they sense that what they have been waiting for is becoming possible. They were growing confident. But there was someone they did not know about, someone who had been watching me for 2 years from the outside, not from inside our network, not from inside their plan, but from a position between the two. A man who had been paid to observe and report, and who was at this moment sitting with a decision that would determine which side of this story he ended up on. I had not told Dominic about him. Not yet. The snow that February was the kind Chicago produces when it has decided to make a point. Not the decorative fall of early December light and photogenic and gone by noon. This was the accumulated weight of a winter that had been building since October, gray and dense and settled into every surface. The kind that muffles sound and makes the city feel smaller than it is. I sat in the wingback chair in the front parlor with a blanket across my lap and a cup of tea on the side table. And I watched the window fill with white, and I let my right hand tremble slightly against the armrest. Caleb was due at 10. I had been practicing the tremor for 2 weeks, not in front of a mirror that would have felt like something I could not name and did not want to, but functionally in the moments that would count. The slight hesitation before reaching for something. The pause in the middle of a sentence that reads as searching for a word rather than choosing one carefully. The way a man in his late 60s who has been in pain and under stress and not sleeping well looks when he is also beginning, perhaps, to lose the thread of things. 40 years of investigative work had taught me one reliable principle people believe, what confirms what they already want to be true. Caleb had decided for reasons of his own financial survival that I was declining. Everything I showed him would be filtered through that decision before it reached his judgment. I did not need to be a convincing actor. I needed only to not contradict what he had already concluded. He arrived at 10:12 with Valeria, who carried a container of soup she had not made herself. I recognized the packaging from a deli on the north side, and the particular energy of 2 people who have discussed their approach to a situation before arriving at it. I let Caleb help me out of the chair to greet them. I did not need the help. I accepted it anyway. We sat in the parlor. The soup was reheated in my kitchen by Valeria, who moved through the space with an ease that told me she had been mentally cataloging it for some time. I watched her pause at the entrance to the hallway that led to the collection room, glance down it, and then return to the kitchen without comment. It was a 3-second assessment. I noted it. Caleb asked about my medication schedule, then about whether I had spoken to anyone about estate planning recently, then with a transition so smooth it would have impressed me professionally. He mentioned that he had been speaking to a financial advisor, not Elias. Someone knew about the possibility of consolidating my assets under a management structure that would reduce my administrative burden. It's just something to consider, he said, and given everything you've been managing. I set my teacup down in the saucer with a slight rattle. I suppose that makes sense, I said. I've been finding it harder to keep track of things lately. I watched his expression. There was a quality to the attention behind his eyes that I had spent a month learning to read accurately. Not relief exactly, and not pleasure, because Caleb was too careful for visible pleasure. It was something more controlled than that. The inner stillness of a man who has just received confirmation of a variable he has been monitoring. Valeria came back from the kitchen with the soup. I ate slowly. I lost the thread of 2 sentences, each time recovering it, with a slight frown that read, I believed as frustration at my own confusion rather than performance. By the time they left at 2 in the afternoon, Caleb had gently suggested twice that having someone around the house more regularly might be worth considering. I told him I would think about it. I walked them to the door, moving carefully, one hand on the wall. I watched their car pull out of the driveway. Then I stood in the hallway for a moment, alone in my quiet house, and I breathed normally. 3 days later, Elias called. He had intercepted information through a professional contact, a paralegal at a firm he had worked with on probate matters for several years, who had mentioned in passing that she had been asked to prepare initial documentation for an Article 11A petition in Cook County Circuit Court. The named respondent was Benedict Alton Lawrence. The petitioner was Caleb Lawrence. Article 11A of the Illinois Probate Act, a legal guardianship petition. The formal mechanism for arguing before a circuit judge that another person is no longer capable of managing their own affairs. The petition required, among other things, a physician's affidavit confirming cognitive impairment. I called Dr. Frost immediately. He confirmed he had received a written inquiry from a law office he did not recognize, requesting his assessment of my cognitive status. He had not responded. Don't respond, I said. Not yet. That evening at 7:41, the camera in the portrait frame recorded Valeria in the front parlor. She had told me she had forgotten her scarf. I had let her in and gone to make tea, and she had apparently used the 4 minutes I was in the kitchen to make a phone call. I watched the footage later that night. I could not hear both sides of the conversation. The camera captured audio from within the room, and Valeria's voice was the only one present. But what she said was sufficient. He's weaker than I expected. His hands were shaking before we even sat down. A pause. I know, but if it keeps going like this, we might not need Plan B at all. I sat in front of the laptop in my upstairs study and played the clip 3 times. Plan B. I knew what Plan A was, the guardianship petition, the financial consolidation, the slow legal dismantling of my autonomy, while I appeared too diminished to resist it. I had planned for Plan A. I had built a counter to Plan A. I had spent 4 months preparing every element of the response to Plan A. I did not know what Plan B was. At 6 in the morning, I called Dominic. Plan B, I said when he answered. Valeria mentioned it last night on camera. She said they might not need it if I keep declining. What is it? The silence on the other end lasted 4 seconds. With Dominic, 4 seconds was not a pause. It was a considered interval. I have a strong hypothesis, he said. I'm running down the confirmation now, but Benedict... Another pause. If I'm right about what it is, we cannot wait for it to develop. We move to the final phase before they can use it. How long do you need? 24 hours, maybe less. I stood at the window in my study looking out at the February snow. The oak tree in the back garden was barely visible through the white. The answer, when it came, did not come from Dominic. It did not come from Elias. It arrived that afternoon in the form of a text message, no name attached. Just a Michigan Avenue address I recognized immediately, and a single line, I think it's time we talked. I'll be at the corner table. He was already at the corner table when I arrived. I had known he would be. People who send messages like the one I had received do not send them, and then arrive late. The punctuality is part of the communication, a way of establishing before anything is said that they understand what is expected of them. He was perhaps 40 years old, with the kind of build that suggested he had once been in a physical profession and had transitioned to one that required different skills without losing the habits of the first. His hands were flat on the table, palms down, fingers spread, the posture of someone demonstrating quite deliberately that they were not reaching for anything. I sat down across from him. He said, "My name is Marcus Holt." "I know," I said. He absorbed this without visible reaction, which told me he was good at his work. "Then you know why I'm here." "I have a theory," I said. "Tell me yours." He picked up his coffee. It was already half empty, which meant he had been here longer than the table had been held, and set it down again without drinking. 8 years ago, he said, I was named as a person of interest in a racketeering investigation. I wasn't involved, but I had done contract work for two of the people who were, and the association was enough to make me look involved. The case was building against me based on surveillance records that had been selectively interpreted by investigators who had already decided what the answer was. He paused, as someone submitted an independent analysis of the surveillance timeline that established I was not at the locations in question during the relevant windows. The case against me was dropped. I never met that person. I knew the name. He looked at me across the table. That was your work, he said. It had been. A freelance consulting job for a defense attorney I had worked with, intermittently a case I had taken, because the timeline analysis was exactly the kind of problem I found genuinely interesting, and because the underlying conclusion when I reached it was that the initial interpretation had been sloppy. I had not known the name of the person it cleared. I rarely did. That's the first reason, I said. The second reason walked into my office in October of last year, Marcus said. A man I didn't know. He sat down across from my desk, opened a folder, and placed two case files in front of me. Documentation from two investigations I had conducted 5 and 7 years ago, where my methodology had certain irregularities. He held my gaze. He didn't say anything about them. He didn't make any requests. He simply placed them on my desk and waited. Dominic, I said. He never introduced himself. But yes, after he left, I did some research. It took me 3 days. Something moved in Marcus's expression, not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. Your colleague is very good at disappearing. And the third reason, Marcus reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and placed an envelope on the table, the same standard size, the same absence of identifying marks, as the one that had arrived under my front door in December. Caleb Lawrence has not paid me on schedule for the past 3 months, he said. A man in my profession cannot sustain a pattern of unreliable clients. But more to the point, he paused, and for the first time since I had sat down, something genuine appeared in his face beneath the professional calibration. There are things I will do for money, and there are things I won't. When I understood what the full scope of his plan included, I reached the second category. He slid the envelope across the table. Then he reached into the same pocket and produced a USB drive, which he placed beside it. The envelope contains a single item, he said. A photograph of a trust instrument I found among documents Caleb asked me to courier to a notary in November. I recognized the name of the deceased signatory. I made a copy before delivering it. I picked up the envelope. I did not open it. I already knew what it contained. And the drive, 26 months of communication records between myself and Caleb Lawrence. Text messages, email, threads, voicemails I recorded on my own device. He looked at me steadily. Illinois is a one-party consent state. Everything on that drive was legally obtained. I am one of the parties to every communication on it. One-party consent under Illinois law means that any participant in a conversation may record it without informing the other participants. Every record Marcus had made of his own interactions with Caleb was admissible evidence. 26 months of documentation, the directives, the payments, the instructions, the requests, including, Marcus said, a series of voice messages from approximately 3 weeks ago, in which Caleb Lawrence retained the services of a man named Ray Coulter for what was described as a maintenance job at a residential property. He stopped. Ray Coulter is not a maintenance worker. He has a specific service history: staged utility incidents, gas line irregularities, electrical system failures. The kind that produce outcomes that read in subsequent investigation as accidents. The kind that produce outcomes. I held that phrase for a moment and let it mean what it meant. When is Coulter scheduled? I asked. Within the next week. The timing is flexible based on access opportunity. I put the USB drive in my coat pocket and stood. I pulled on my coat with the deliberate movements of a man who has decided what comes next, and is in no hurry because he has already done the waiting. Marcus remained seated watching me with the stillness of someone who understood that the meeting was concluding on my terms. At the door, I stopped. One question, I said, without turning fully. Does Caleb know you're here? No, Marcus said, and he won't. I nodded once. Then I walked out onto Michigan Avenue into the February snow, and I took out my phone and I called Dominic first and Torres second. And I told each of them the same thing in different words. It ends tomorrow. That night after the calls, I drove home through streets that were white and quiet and entirely indifferent to what was coming. I went to the collection room and sat in the dark without turning on the lights, and I looked at the display cases where 31 reproduction stamps had been sitting since October, patiently holding the shape of something they were not. Through the window, the last of the February snow was falling in the light from the street lamp. For the first time in 4 months, I did not feel the weight of what I was carrying as something I had to manage. I felt it as something almost finished. At 6:47 that morning, Dominic sent me 3 words: "Coulter is secured." I read the message in the pre-dawn dark of the room they had prepared for me on the 7th floor of Northwestern Memorial, the same floor. 3 rooms down from where I had spent 4 days in January, with 2 fractured ribs and a different kind of clarity than the one I was carrying now. I set the phone face down on the bed beside me and looked at the ceiling and breathed carefully. The way you breathe when pain management is still recent and your ribs remember things your mind has moved past. Ray Coulter had been intercepted at 5:15 in the morning, 11 blocks from my villa, in a vehicle that contained materials consistent with the staged utility work Marcus Holt had described. He had, according to the brief message Torres sent 40 minutes later, waived his right to counsel and signed a proffer agreement before 6 o'clock, the formal arrangement by which a suspect agrees to provide complete information in exchange for prosecutorial consideration of leniency. The word Torres used was immediately, not after deliberation, not after a phone call, in the first minutes, which told me everything I needed to know about the quality of Ray Coulter's commitment to Caleb Lawrence's interests when presented with the alternative. His signed statement, she wrote, confirmed the solicitation, confirmed the nature of the work, confirmed the name of the man who had hired him. By 7 o'clock, I was in position. Dr. Frost had arrived at 6:30. He was not a theatrical man. I had known him for 15 years, and I could count on one hand the number of times I had seen him do anything that was not measured and precise, but what he did in those 30 minutes was, in its own way, a kind of performance. He adjusted the monitoring equipment. He set the room. He briefed the nursing staff on the floor, in terms carefully chosen to be technically accurate without being complete. Then he sat in the chair beside my bed for 10 minutes and did not say anything. When he stood to leave, he put his hand briefly on my arm. "Try not to enjoy this too much," he said. It was the closest thing to a joke I had ever heard him make. I did not respond because I was, as of that moment, no longer a person who could respond. I was a body in a bed, eyes closed, chest rising and falling in the shallow rhythm of a man whose brain had approximately 90 minutes earlier experienced a significant ischemic event in the left hemisphere. The monitors beside me confirmed this story with the patient indifferent authority of machines that do not know they are lying. Agent Torres and her team were in the corridor. Elias had prepared the documents. I waited. 40 years of investigative work involves a great deal of waiting. You wait for people to make decisions. You wait for evidence to accumulate. You wait for the moment when everything that has been building in private becomes visible in the world. I had never in 4 decades waited for something I had built entirely myself. From a position of complete stillness, in a room that smelled of antiseptic and recycled air, listening to my own heartbeat on a monitor. It was 31 minutes before I heard the door, Caleb's voice first lower than usual. Controlled in the way that voices become controlled when their owner is managing something larger than the conversation. I heard him speak briefly to someone in the hallway, a register of gratitude and concern deployed for the benefit of whoever was listening, and then the door opened fully, and I heard 2 sets of footsteps enter the room. Dr. Frost's voice. The clinical summary delivered with the same precision he brought to everything ischemic stroke, left hemisphere, stable but non-responsive prognosis uncertain, likely permanent cognitive impact if he recovers at all. A pause for questions. Caleb asked 2, both of them framed in the language of a concerned son that I had been listening to for months and had long since learned to translate. Then Dr. Frost's pager sounded real, because Torres had arranged it and he excused himself, and the door closed. Silence. I counted to 7. Then Caleb spoke. His voice had dropped further, not a whisper, because a whisper carries its own self-consciousness, but the low, flat register of a man who believes he is unobserved and is allowing himself to think out loud. "We need to move on the trust filing before the end of the week." A pause, and I heard Valeria shift her position near the window. If his condition holds, the guardianship petition becomes moot. The trust instrument takes precedence once the death certificate is issued. Valeria said something I did not fully hear. The exchange records are already segregated, Caleb said. Elias doesn't have access to the secondary LLC, and the Coulter arrangement resolves itself. There's nothing connecting us to him directly. Another pause. 30 days, Valeria said clearly this time. That's all we need. If he goes in the next 30 days, everything transfers cleanly. The insurance, the property, all of it. In my right ear through the device Dr. Frost had placed there during the setup, I heard Torres's voice. Quiet, precise. That's sufficient. Whenever you're ready. I opened my eyes. I did not sit up immediately. I let my eyes open first, just that. Just the simple mechanical fact of eyelids rising, and I looked at the ceiling for 1 full second. And then I turned my head to the left, toward the chair where Caleb was standing. He was looking at his phone. He saw the movement in his peripheral vision before he processed what it meant. And in the half second before understanding arrived, his face was simply open, unguarded. Without the architecture of performance he had been maintaining for months. I saw him clearly in that half second. Then understanding arrived, and what replaced the openness was something I had no precise word for. I sat up. The monitor beside me adjusted its readings as I moved, and the sound of it changing made Valeria turn from the window. She took 1 step back, not dramatically, just the single involuntary step of a body responding to something the mind hasn't caught up with yet. No one said anything for 3 seconds. The door opened. Agent Torres came through first badge in hand, followed by 3 members of her team. She did not look at me. She was already speaking the formal language of federal arrest rights being read, the machinery of consequence beginning its motion. I looked at Caleb, not with anger. Anger had not been the dominant thing for a long time. What I felt looking at my son across a hospital room at 7:43 in the morning was something closer to grief that had already finished its hardest work and was now simply present the way a scar is present, not painful in the acute sense, but permanent and yours. I have been waiting for this morning for 4 months, Caleb, I said. He didn't answer. Torres was between us now, and he was looking at her, and the person who had been performing the role of my son for the past year was already beginning the next performance, the one for attorneys and judges and the record. As Valeria was moved toward the door, she turned and looked at Caleb once. I watched that look. I had spent 40 years reading what people meant when they couldn't afford to say it directly, and what I read in that moment was not love and not loyalty, and not even fear exactly. It was the specific expression of a person who has just understood that the arrangement they believed protected them does not in fact protect them, and that the worst of what is coming has not arrived yet. She did not know about the 47 videos. She would. Courtrooms have a particular quality of silence that other rooms do not. It is not the silence of emptiness or the silence of peace. It is the silence of a space that has been designed architecturally and procedurally to make certain things impossible to avoid. In a courtroom, there is nowhere to look that does not mean something, nowhere to sit that does not position you in relation to something else. I had testified in civil proceedings dozens of times over the course of my career, insurance fraud cases, asset disputes. The slow machinery of accountability grinding through formal channels, and I had always understood intellectually what a courtroom was for. I had not previously sat in one as a victim. I had completed my testimony that morning, 3 hours on the stand, with the prosecuting attorney leading me through the full chronology from Stuart Mead's visit in September of the previous year to the morning in March when I had sat up in a hospital bed and watched my son try to remember how to arrange his face. The defense attorneys for both defendants had cross-examined me in the afternoon. I had answered their questions accurately and without elaboration, which is the only reliable approach when someone is trying to find a gap between what you know and what you can prove. When the court recessed for the evening and reconvened the following morning, I was permitted to remain in the victim's seating area for the remainder of the proceedings. I sat in the second row, behind the prosecution table, and I watched. The prosecutor's name was Linda Vasquez. She was 48. With the particular kind of patience that develops in people who have spent years presenting complex evidence to juries who have not lived inside it the way the investigators have. She moved through the 6 charges with the methodical confidence of someone who knew which pieces of the architecture were weight-bearing and which were supplementary. Wire fraud, securities fraud, elder financial exploitation, aggravated battery of a senior citizen, conspiracy to commit murder, forgery of legal instruments. She did not rush. She did not editorialize. She let the charges accumulate in the air of the room the way they had accumulated in the evidence file, one on top of another. Each one a different color of the same decision my son and his wife had made over the course of more than a year. Caleb sat at the defendant's table to the left. He was wearing a suit I recognized the gray one he had worn to Margaret's funeral, which I had not known until I saw him in it this morning, and which had produced a feeling I did not yet have a name for. He was looking at a point somewhere between the prosecution table and the wall behind it, with the focused neutrality of a man who has been advised to give nothing away, and is following that advice with the same discipline he had always applied to things he needed from the outside. Valeria sat at a separate table to the right with her own attorney. She had been looking at the surface of the table since the session began. The defense attorney for Valeria, a woman named Patterson who had a reputation for successfully arguing reduced culpability in conspiracy cases, rose to present her preliminary argument. She characterized Valeria as a secondary participant, a person who had operated under the direction and psychological influence of the primary defendant. She used the word coercion 3 times in 4 minutes. Linda Vasquez waited. When Patterson finished, Vasquez stood and said, "Your Honor, the people would like to present Exhibit 47C at this time." The large screen on the east wall of the courtroom came to life. I was watching Valeria when it happened, for the entirety of the morning, through the reading of charges, through the opening statements, through Patterson's characterization of her as someone who had been led rather than led. Valeria's face had maintained a quality of careful control, not the performance Caleb had been giving, which was the deliberate blankness of a man managing information. Valeria's control was different, tighter, more internal. The expression of a person who is doing the arithmetic of their situation in real time and has not yet arrived at the final number. The moment she understood what the screen was going to show, the arithmetic stopped. It was a single moment, no longer than the time it takes to draw one breath, in which everything she had been holding in position behind her face became briefly visible. Not as an emotion I could name precisely, simply as the absence of the control that had been there, and then the return of it slower and less complete than before. The first video was dated the previous October. It was 41 seconds long. The footage was clean and well lit. She had chosen a good angle, good light, the careful framing of someone who intended the recording to be reviewed. The court watched 47 of them. I will not describe each one. I sat in the second row and watched the screen and listened to the room grow progressively more still as the dates advanced and the pattern became undeniable. What the videos documented was not the work of a person acting under coercion. They documented the work of a person who had found in what she was doing something that satisfied her, a precision, a control, a sense of authorship over an outcome that she had planned and was executing according to her own design. The final video was 1 minute and 12 seconds. Valeria appeared on screen close to the camera, speaking directly into the lens with the matter-of-fact clarity of someone recording a memo to themselves. "Tomorrow the old man signs. After that we won't need him anymore." The courtroom was silent for a long moment after the screen went dark. I looked at Caleb. He had turned his head to the right, away from Valeria's table, away from the screen toward the wall beside his attorney. Not dramatically, just the small, deliberate reorientation of a person choosing not to be associated with what the room had just seen. Valeria looked at him. Across the distance between their 2 tables, through the silence of a room that had just watched 47 pieces of her own evidence, she looked at Caleb Lawrence with an expression that I read, in the way I had learned to read things over 40 years, as the specific comprehension of a person who has just understood the precise nature of the arrangement they were actually in. Not the arrangement they thought they were in, the one that had always been real. His attorney leaned toward him and spoke quietly into his ear. Caleb nodded once. The attorney rose. "Your Honor, the defense requests a 30-minute recess to confer with the defendant." Memo, the judge granted it. I watched Caleb stand and follow his attorney through the side door to the consultation room. He did not look at me. He did not look at Valeria. He moved with the steady, forward-facing purpose of a man who has identified his next calculation and is already working on it. "You are still calculating," I thought, watching the door close behind him. "Even now. Even here. It is the only thing you have ever known how to do." When Caleb walked back through the side door of the courtroom, I knew what had been decided before his attorney said a word. It was in the way he sat down, not the careful blankness of the morning session, but the particular settled quality of a person who has made a calculation and closed the window behind them. I had seen it before in 40 years of watching people decide between 2 kinds of loss and choose the one they could better manage. He had looked at the mathematics of his situation during those 30 minutes, and he had arrived at the only answer that made arithmetic sense. His attorney addressed the court. Caleb Lawrence would cooperate fully with the prosecution. He would provide additional testimony regarding the planning and execution of the infrasound device installation and the systematic medication substitution, specifically the timeline of decisions, the sourcing of materials, and the chain of instruction that the 47 videos had documented in action but not in origin. In exchange, the prosecution would recommend a consolidated sentence of 18 years in federal custody across the 6 counts: wire fraud, securities fraud, elder financial exploitation, aggravated battery of a senior citizen conspiracy to commit murder and forgery of legal instruments. The judge noted the agreement. She noted Valeria's continued position of non-cooperation. She scheduled sentencing for the following week. I sat in the victim seating and listened to the numbers settle into the record of the court. Valeria received 25 years. The additional charges: attempted murder, aggravated poisoning, elder abuse, conspiracy, and aggravated stalking for the sustained campaign of infrasound exposure and pharmaceutical substitution, accumulated without the reduction that cooperation would have provided. She sat through the reading without visible expression, which I noted as the last act of control available to her, and recognized it as such. Caleb received 18. I do not know what I expected to feel when I heard those words spoken aloud in a room designed for exactly this moment. What I actually felt was something I did not recognize immediately. Not relief, not triumph, not the satisfaction of a case closed. Something quieter and more disorienting than any of those. I walked out of the courthouse into the April air and stood on the steps for a moment, and the city moved around me with complete indifference, and I breathed and I understood. The word for what I felt was free, not from grief. Grief does not resolve on a courtroom schedule. Not from the loss of what Caleb had been before he became what he was, but from the weight of carrying what I had known and could not yet prove for months while continuing to function inside it. That weight had a name I had not given it while I was under it. Standing on the courthouse steps in April, I gave it the name. Then I went home and waited 3 months. The morning of the transfer in late July, the sky over Chicago was the pale washed-out blue of a summer that has been going too long and knows it. I drove to the facility outside the city and parked and stood near the gate, and I waited. I had not told anyone I was coming. Not Dominic, not Elias, not Dr. Frost. There are things a man needs to do without witnesses, and this was one of them. The gate opened at 7:45. Caleb came through with 2 correctional officers wearing the clothing he had arrived in, the gray suit, again the one he had worn to the courthouse, the one he had worn to his mother's funeral. And he was scanning the area the way people do when they have resigned themselves to a thing, but are still cataloging their surroundings out of habit. He saw me. He stopped. Then he did something I had not anticipated and cannot fully account for. Even now, he went to his knees. Not gradually, not with the controlled descent of a performance. He went down the way people go down when something has been holding them upright for a long time and suddenly stops all at once. With a sound I did not hear because the wind took it. His hands went to the ground. He said my name in a voice that I had last heard when he was perhaps 9 years old and had fallen off his bicycle on the driveway and was frightened. He said he was sorry. He said it more than once. I walked toward him. I stopped 3 steps away. I adjusted my scarf, the gray wool one Margaret had given me the winter before she got sick, which I had been wearing every cold morning since without thinking about it until this moment. I straightened it with both hands slowly. The way you straighten something that doesn't need straightening when you need a moment to be certain of what comes next. Then I looked at him. I have no son, I said. The son I loved died the day he put a pen to his mother's name and signed it. I turned around. I walked back to my car with the July wind at my back, and I did not hear what came after, if anything did, and I did not turn my head. The drive back to the city took 40 minutes. I noted the exits as I passed them the way I always had on long drives, and I did not think about anything that required more effort than that. That evening on my desk, I found a sealed envelope from a notary office downtown, printed on the label in the formal language of legal administration. Second Testament, Caleb Ware, Lawrence, to be opened in the presence of the named beneficiary as required by Illinois Probate Code. I sat down in the chair behind my desk. I reached into the bottom drawer and found the bottle of scotch I kept for the kind of evenings that didn't fit any other category. I poured 2 fingers into a glass and set it on the desk beside the envelope, and I looked at the 2 of them for a moment. Then I picked up the envelope. Caleb's attorney called at 8:43 in the morning. I was already in the car engine, idling parked half a block from the notary's building. The man spoke quickly, the way people speak when they believe good news belongs to them too. He said the procedural filing had cleared. He said the document was ready to be opened. He said he hoped today would bring some closure. I thanked him and ended the call. I sat for a moment in the quiet of the car. Outside, the September light fell across the sidewalk in long, pale strips. The kind of light that arrives after summer, lets go, but before autumn has fully committed to its own weight. It was, I thought, a strangely peaceful morning for what it contained. The notary's name was Gerald Marsh. His office was on the 14th floor of a building on West Washington, and it smelled of carpet and filtered air, and the particular stillness of a room where consequential things are handled without ceremony. He was already seated when I arrived. The envelope sat on the desk between us. He opened it correctly, both hands, the letter opener drawn slowly along the seal, no flourish. One sheet of paper. He smoothed it flat against the desk, with his palm adjusted his glasses, and began to read. He stopped. Not long. 3, perhaps 4 seconds. He looked up at me over the rim of his frames. I held his gaze and said nothing. He looked back down at the page and continued. Then he read aloud as the procedure required. To Caleb, you have taught me the most valuable lesson of my life, that a parent's blind love is the most dangerous weapon an ungrateful child can use. I thank you for that. He finished. He set the document flat on the desk. No assets, no distributions, no name beneficiaries, no amounts. Nothing transferred, nothing withheld. One sentence, a closing declaration. My signature. 2 witnesses and a notarial seal. Gerald Marsh looked at me and said nothing. I nodded once. I stood put on my coat and left. I drove home without stopping. The house was quiet in the way it had become quiet over the past year, not empty, but settled as though the rooms had finally exhaled. I did not go upstairs. I walked directly to the basement door, opened it, and went down. The 3rd step creaked same as always. The furnace clicked in the corner. The exposed pipe along the western wall looked exactly as it had 11 months before, the last time I was here. I pressed the 2nd bracket and held it for a count of 4. Then the combination, June 7th, 1971, and the concealed door swung open without resistance. The velvet box was there exactly as I had left it, 31 pieces each wrapped in archival tissue undisturbed. And beside the box, resting upright against the steel wall, was an envelope. I had not thought about it in years. The paper had stayed white, the sealed dark had preserved it, but the ink on the front had gone the color of weak tea. My own handwriting in a fountain pen I no longer owned. For Caleb. To be opened when you are ready to read it. I had written those words in the autumn of 2004. Caleb had been 8 years old. Margaret was still alive, still reading to him some evenings before bed. I had come down here one night while the house was warm above me, and I had written what I believed every son deserved to inherit from his father before the father was gone. The record of who the man had been when the boy was still too young to understand. The fears I carried, the failures I had not yet corrected, the things I hoped for him. I had sealed the envelope and placed it in the safe the same evening behind the false pipe section, and I had not opened it again. I carried it upstairs without opening it now either. I stood in front of the living room fireplace. The fire had been burning since morning. I held the envelope in both hands, reading my own handwriting one more time. Then I placed it into the flames. The paper caught along the right edge first. The fire moved slowly leftward, unhurried, almost careful, the way fire behaves when what it is consuming was once carefully made. The ink darkened before it disappeared. Each line went from legible to faint to nothing. The words for what I had hoped, the words for what I had feared. The words I had addressed to a boy who no longer existed in the way I had imagined him. The paper began to curl inward as the heat took hold. The corners folded toward the center, as though the letter were closing itself. I did not look away. When the last corner blackened and crumbled into the grate, I remained still for a moment longer. The ash was pale gray, barely there, a small collapse in the embers, and it was gone. No tears, no words. I turned away from the fire and went back to the basement. I carried the velvet box upstairs with both hands and set it on the living room table beside the framed photograph of Margaret that had stood in that spot for 11 years. In the photograph, she is looking slightly past the camera. She always did that. She told me once that she could never quite believe a photograph was interested in her face. I opened the box, 31 pieces, found in different cities across different decades with her beside me for nearly all of them. I looked at the collection. I looked at her face. I knew what came next. I had known for some time, long before the trial, long before the arrests. Perhaps even before the night I first placed the fake stamps inside this same box and hid the real ones below the floor. The plan had lived quietly in the back of my mind, waiting for a moment that felt like completion rather than conclusion. That moment was now. I rested my hand on the lid of the box and I looked at her photograph and I thought, tomorrow. Tomorrow I begin the last thing. The first snow of the season had come overnight. By the time I arrived at the Art Institute, the broad stone steps along Michigan Avenue were dusted white at the edges, and the 2 bronze lines that flanked the entrance wore a thin, indifferent coat of it across their shoulders. I stood at the base of the steps for a moment before going in. The velvet box was under my arm. The city moved around me at its usual pace, unhurried by the cold. Inside, the woman at the collection's intake desk looked at me the way people look at something they want to examine more carefully before they allow themselves to believe it. She had read the preliminary documents my attorney filed the week before, so she knew what I was bringing. She knew the name on the collection. She still looked at the box as though the contents might be something other than what they were. They were exactly what they were. 31 pieces, 4 decades of searching, most of them shared. A Columbia Exposition block found for $8 at an estate sale in Evanston in 1997. A 1918 inverted Jenny acquired quietly at a regional auction in Indianapolis a decade later. 29 others each, with a provenance each with a memory attached that belonged only to 2 people, one of whom was no longer here to carry her half. I signed the transfer documents. The woman asked if I wanted a moment before the formal handover. I said no, I was ready. The Margaret Collins Ware collection, I was informed, would be cataloged and placed in the permanent study archive within 60 days, with selected pieces to be exhibited in the Philatelic Gallery the following spring. A small brass plate would carry her name. I thanked her and left. The Margaret Collins Ware Foundation had been formally registered 3 weeks earlier. The recovered funds from the federal asset forfeiture processed under court order, transferred upon clearance, had been directed in full to the endowment. The Foundation's charter contained a single restriction written in plain language and reviewed by 2 attorneys before filing. No distribution, benefit, inheritance, or indirect transfer of any kind would ever reach Caleb Ware Lawrence or any legal heir acting on his behalf in perpetuity. It had taken 1 sentence to write. I had not needed to think about it for long. Dominic arrived at the villa at 4:30. Elias came 20 minutes later, still in his coat, his scarf not quite unwound from his neck. I had set 3 glasses on the low table beside the fireplace and opened a bottle of scotch I had been saving without quite knowing what for. We did not talk about the case. We did not review the timeline or account for the charges or discuss what would happen at Caleb's first parole hearing in 18 years. The fire crackled. The snow outside had resumed fine and steady against the windows. Dominic refilled his own glass without asking which was the correct thing to do. After a while, Elias looked at me and said, "Do you have any regrets?" I looked into my glass. "About what?" I said. "About anything." "No," I said. Elias nodded slowly the way a man nods when the answer confirms something he already suspected, but needed to hear spoken aloud. Dominic said nothing. The fire said enough. They left when the sky had gone fully dark. I watched the taillights of Dominic's car disappear through the gate, and then stood in the open doorway for a moment before closing it. I looked around the room. No velvet box on the table. No sealed envelope on the desk. No pills in the cabinet that were not what they claimed to be. No low-frequency hum behind the walls. No second signature on a document I had never signed. The room was only a room. The fireplace, the armchair, the oak bookshelves, the portrait of Margaret on the wall above the mantel. And the quiet that had slowly over the past several months begun to feel like something other than emptiness. I put on my coat. I opened the front door and stepped outside. The cold arrived immediately, clean and unambiguous. The snow was still falling, small flakes unhurried. I stood on the top step and breathed in slowly until my lungs were full, and then I closed my eyes. I felt each flake land on my face, some on my forehead, some at the corner of my jaw, one on my closed eyelid gone before I could decide what it felt like. I had heard it said over a long career spent in rooms where people lied to each other about what they wanted and who they were, that a man's most dangerous enemy is the one he loves most completely. 40 years of work had shown me that was true more times than I cared to number. I had seen it ruin men who were sharper than I was, and more prepared than I had ever been. But standing in the snow that night, I understood something I had not understood before, or perhaps had understood, and needed to earn the right to say. A man is not free because he has no enemies. A man is free because he looked his most dangerous enemy in the eye and did not look away. I opened my eyes. Above me, the Chicago sky was the color of old pewter, the snow falling out of it in silence. I turned and went back inside. The room was warm. I poured a small measure of scotch into my glass, sat down in the armchair, and looked at her portrait. The familiar angle of her face, turned just past the edge of the frame, not absent, never absent, but always looking at something I could not follow her toward. I did not speak. She knew, I knew, that was enough. 40 years as a detective, and the hardest case I ever worked was the one that slept under my own roof. This is what I know. Now, family betrayal does not arrive loudly. It arrives in small surrenders, a signature here, a silence there, until the architecture of trust has been quietly hollowed out from within. I have seen family betrayal ruin men sharper than me, men more prepared than me, and I nearly let it ruin me too. If this family story teaches you anything, let it be this: do not love the way I loved. Love with your eyes open. Even God in His mercy does not reward blindness, He rewards faithfulness. Do not wait until you are standing alone in the snow to understand what freedom costs. Family betrayal leaves scars that no courtroom can fully close. But a family story does not have to end in silence. It can end in clarity if you are willing to see the truth before it sees you first. My opinion: the most dangerous person in your life is rarely a stranger. If this family story moved something in, you leave a comment, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. Thank you for staying until the very end. It means more than you know. Some stories ahead contain fictional elements crafted purely for educational purposes. If this type of content is not right for you, feel free to step away and choose something that serves you better. Knowing what you need is never the wrong choice.